Today's stuff we're going to learn is Nazir, Daf Lamed Hey. This week's learning is sponsored by Hillary and Eric Rothman in memory of Dr. Simra Shane Zichrono Levacha, Simcha Ezra Ben Noach, a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, an accomplished surgeon, and a highly respected gentleman who left his family, learning Torah and helping people. Today's daf is sponsored by Risa Tzohar in loving memory of her daughter Esther Dina Harari Zichrono Levacha. And also our learning is a memory of Hillel and Yagel Yaniv, who were murdered yesterday. We're hoping for more peaceful and calmer days in Israel, not an easy period. Okay, we're going to get started with this quote at the end of yesterday's daf. So let's just do a quick review. We started with, in the Mishnah, besides a whole bunch of different machlokot, they had one particular machloket we're dealing with, which didn't even appear in the Mishnah as a machloket, but the Gemara pointed out that when it said Shlosha minim asurim b'nazir, and then it said anything that's yotzei min hagefen, it seemed to be things that come out of the vine, which seem to include only the fruits themselves, not the leaves and the tendrils. To which we said it obviously doesn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer. There's different girsaot. Some have Rabbi Elazar, some have Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to just leave it as Rabbi Eliezer. But it doesn't hold like our Mishnah doesn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer, who basically says that also the alim and the lulavim, also the leaves, the grape leaves, and the tendrils are forbidden. And then we said that they each have a different style of, number one, there's two issues they differ on. One is how to darshan. Do we darshan with the klal prat category of drashot, which is the Rabbi Yishmael approach, or the ribui miut approach? Which happens to be Rabbi Akiva, who's usually the Baal Machloket of Rabbi Yishmael, and they often have different methods of how to extrapolate the Torah. And I'm going to tell you, if you look up some basic things about klal and prat versus ribui and miut, you'll find the following things. And I say this very specifically because today's daf seems to a little bit break some of the rules, and we're going to have to deal with that as we go through. There's a number of things in our daf that are complicated, and I say complicated, not so much complicated to understand, but they don't make sense in light of other things. And there's going to be some places where perhaps there's mistakes in the text that we have. Perhaps I'll raise them as we go along. But if you were to look up basic details about klal prat versus ribui miut, so you'll see again, it's Rabbi Yishmael versus the school of Rabbi Akiva, generally they say. And, like, for example, Rabbi Akiva does darish every et in the Torah, and Rabbi Yishmael didn't do that, right? Dibrat Torah kol lashon bnei adam. They have all sorts of differences between them in terms of methods, how to do this. As I mentioned yesterday, ribui miut is generally, it's going to end up including more things, more inclusive. Klal prat is generally, it ends up becoming more specific. Okay, so if you have the exact same words and you're going to call it ribui miut to that and klal prat to that, you're going to end up with klal prat is going to be more limited, ribui miut is going to be more inclusive of things. Again, minorly, not by a major difference. Okay, anything else I want to say? That's all I can think of right now. And in this case, there's a particular additional difference between them, which is, in our pasuk, we had all the details. Remember, don't drink wine, don't drink vinegar, don't have, the dried grapes also. And then it said, this general, kol yimei nizro, mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin, a generalization. And that was where Rabbi Eliezer stopped and said, we have we have a miut and then a ribui, a specific and then a generalization. And from there, he got to the conclusion, we're going to include a lot more things because that's where it ends. Other approach of the rabbi said, no, what do you mean? It says mechartzanim v'adzak at the end. It becomes specific again. It's a klal, prat, klal, uprat. You have specific, generalization, and specific. And then it's only going to be like the specific, which we said includes fruits and any solet of the pri, right? So we're going to include anything that's like the fruit, anything that's like solet of the fruit. Actually put these on the chart for today, the end of yesterday's stuff. So now, if you look in the study guide for today. So now if you look, we're going to start again from Amar Mar. The Gemara responded to this drasha that we had and said the following, with 6 lines from the bottom of my Gemara. Ima prat before ash pri gamor af kol pri gamor. Why are we saying it's like the prat in the sense that it's pri and it's psolet pri? It's also like bad stuff, let's say vinegar, when it spoils. Why don't you just say it's anything that's like grapes, the fruit itself, and not the psolet? To which they said, im ken, amarta im ken, ma inyacha katuv b'mashma'o shelo amaro. What do you mean? Everything that's like a fruit is already mentioned. Anavim lachim v'yeveshim are mentioned. Yain v'chometz also written. Therefore, it says, therefore, it must not be just pre, which is the lashon acharon that we just suggested. It must be what we said originally, pre and psolet pre. And then it includes, we already said yesterday, that includes also unripe grapes. And it also includes, the psolet is going to include also worm-infested grapes. To which the Gemara now says, right, they continue quoting what we already said yesterday. This is all just a quote, and you're going to see the real reason why they're bringing this is for starting from now. If in the end, we're going to basically be very inclusive, meaning also the anything that's like the pre and anything that's like the psolet, we're becoming more inclusive. What do we need chartzanim v'adzag for? Why do you need another prat in the end? Could have just learned that from prat klal, to which they say no, you couldn't have. Because lomar lecha, this is to teach you the general rules of the klal prats, that what? Say prat klal, anytime you have a specific, and then you become more general, it's not like the specifics, like the details. In a prat, you can't say this is all the rules here are. It's only going to be including things that are like the details. Ela nasa klal mosif ala prat. We're going to say when you go prat and then klal, as opposed to klal and then prat. When you go in the order of specifics and then general, it means to include more things. So if we just had prat to klal, you would have included, for example, the lulavin and the kfanim, and the lulavin and the alim, the leaves and the tendrils. So now we get to, that's right. Again, this is all a quote from things we saw yesterday, but it's good review. Until basically do a prat at the end. If they do a prat at the end, that means again to tell you we're getting only things that are like the details mentioned. So why did we bring this on? For the following question. So from there, mechartzanim v'adzag. Sorry, that was the end of the sentence. Therefore, just like the Nazir, because it says at the end, chartzanim v'adzag. Now we come up with our question. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Who's Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria? Do you remember him? There were a lot of machlokot we saw yesterday. He came up in the Mishnah and he said, you're not liable if you ate a kizayit of kartzanim or a kizayit of zag, right? Either the seeds or the skins by themselves. Because it says mechartzanim va'adzag, you need to eat 2 kartzanim, 2 seeds, and 1 zag, 1 skin. If you didn't eat that, you're not liable. And if you ate that and it didn't have a kizayit in it, you're still liable. Which means, in the rules of drashot, those words are not free for what we want to teach them, what we just said. So according to him, he uses that pasuk for something else. Where is he going to learn this rule, this such important rule about prat uklal prat? That if you end with prat uklal without going on to a prat, we're going to include many things. If you add the prat at the end, which is why chartzanim v'adzag comes at the end, it's to teach you it's only things that are similar. So now where's he going to learn that from? So 2 possibilities. Either Rabbi Eliezer, miut riba. Maybe he holds like Rabbi Eliezer, who doesn't, what's the whole deal? Rabbi Eliezer didn't, first of all, he learned a different method of miut riba. And number 2, he only used the miut and the riba, and he didn't say miut, riba, miut. He didn't use chartzanim v'adzag for his drasha at all. He just said we have the details, the wine and the vinegar and the dried ones, etc. And then we had a general rule. And then Mikol Shea said that's inclusive. So that would be the very simple answer. But the problem with that answer is, it's not that it's a problem, but the Gemara always would prefer not to have to stick someone into someone else's approach, especially if they're minority opinion. So now the Gemara is going to try to explain how you can explain Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, also according to the rabbis who do use chartzanim v'adzag for the prat, klal prat. Ibait ema kirabanan, de isa kadata kadamar Rabbi Elazar ben, right? Ibait ema kirabanan means, alternatively, you could say that he does agree with the rabbis. How so? De isa kadata kadamar. Now, before I move on, I'll remind you of a rule. You can only use words for 1 drasha. Remember, you can't darshan them twice, which is why we're stuck. Unless what? Unless you can prove that there's somehow a way that you can learn 2 things from that 1 verse. How could that be? Well, we'll see. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria. Rahmana. Sorry, I skipped those first words again. I read them before, but let's read it again. If you would think the Chartzanim Ba'adag is coming exclusively to teach you what Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria says, which is 2 Chartzanim, 1 Zag, then it could have just been mentioned in the previous verse. Again, the verse says, don't have wine or beer. Again, we explained the beer a little differently, but no vinegar, anything soaked in wine, lo yishteh, and it should have then said, there's one pasuk which details everything. Then it should have said, why does mechartzanim v'adzag come after the klal? So we're now going to learn from the fact that it says it. Number one, we can learn one thing, which is mechartzanim v'adzag is teaching you need 2 chartzanim and 1 zag, but its placement in the psukim after the klal. Okay, so here, let's read it again inside. Why didn't you put it with all the pratim, with all the details? Why did you put it after the klal? It must be to teach you also the klal prat. Otherwise, it would have been mentioned earlier. It's a pretty good answer, but the Gemara is not fully satisfied with it, because what is the Gemara going to say? You can already think about this yourself. If the whole thing is the placement, maybe it's really just coming to tell you about the placement. It's in such a weird place. It should be there, and it's coming to teach you that. And maybe it's fully coming to teach you that, and not this halacha mechartzanim ba'adzag that Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria wants to say, 2 chartzanim, 1 zag, to which they say, in other words, you could say the placement is what's teaching us, but the simple isn't teaching us anything new. So now they're going to say no. We'll tell you why it's clear. Chartzanim ba'adzag, according to this interpretation, would be able to teach you 2 things. So one is the placement, and the other is im ken. And this is, by the way, usually the tactic they use when they want to learn 2 things. They say the pasuk could have said something else. The fact that it says this instead of what you would have expected must be coming to teach you something else unique. Lichtov oshne chartzanim, oshne zagim. They point out something strange about the phrase mechartzanim v'adzag. It should have just been 2 chartzanim and 2 zagim, which, by the way, it wouldn't have used the word shnei. It would have just said mechartzanim v'adzagim. This is plural, that's plural. Or chartzam v'zag, or both in singular. The point is, why is one plural and one singular? It doesn't make any sense. Now, we did talk yesterday that there was a better proof that the zag was the part on the outside and the skin, and the chartzanim were in the inside, because normally in a grape you have one skin and multiple seeds. But still, they say it seems to be strange that one, if we're saying from one to the other, it should have been from one to the other, or from both to the other 2. And it should have been parallel language. So basically what they're saying is, from there you can learn 2 things. Number 1, from its placement. Number 2, from the language used. Because the language is plural and singular, which is weird, it should be all plural or all singular, you can learn both halachot. So we now, basically all we did right now was, we took Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria, who learns chartzanim v'adzag for something else. We say, how's he going to learn what we just learned before about that it comes to teach us this rule in general about prat, klal, prat, which basically comes to teach us if you have just prat and klal, specific and a generalization, it's going to include many more things. If you have a prat at the end, it's going to tell you, no, only things that are really like the prat, like the details. Then we said, where's Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria going to do it? Because he already learns it from somewhere else, and we resolved that. Now we're going to move on to an interesting question. And this goes against this is what I wanted to tell you that I forgot to tell you before. I knew there was something in my mind about the klal and prat and the ribui and miut, which again, I told you, I'm going to tell you a bunch of things which are going to be contradicted in today's sugya. This is the first one. So Tosfot holds, I said that one is the school of Rabbi Ishmael and one is the school of Rabbi Akiva. The question is, can you do both? Can you pick and choose? So Tosfot says no. Either you darshan klal and prat, or you darshan ribui and miut. You have to belong to one school. You're either doing this kind all over the Torah, or you're doing that kind all over the Torah. There's no picking and choosing. The Ritva says no. You could say, on these psukim, I'm using klal prat, and on these psukim, I'm using ribui and miut. Tosfot's explanation is very difficult in light of this Gemara. I will just point that out right now, because the Gemara is now going to say, Rabbi Eliezer, did darish miut v'riba. Rabbi Eliezer in our sugya uses ribui and miut. That was the whole thing. It's miut, it's specific, right? Again, you can try to use different words to explain the words miut, riba, and klal and prat. In the end, they're both generalizations and specifics. It's where you're getting more specific and more general, different terminology. So you could try and call them something else, but it's easier to use ribui, miut, and klal, prat to klal, because any definition in English is not going to really express what it is. So he uses the miut v'riba type of learning. In our case, prat klal prat manale. Where is he going to learn the prat klal prat rule that we were just talking about? Now, again, according to Tosfot's worldview, he doesn't. Okay, but the Gemara seems to think he does. So this raises the question against Tosfot. I don't have an answer for it, but they seem to think that Rabbi Eliezer also holds that. It seems obvious to them, and the question is, where does he learn from? And for this, we're going to end up with three answers. Our first answer is Rabbi Elazar, and I charted these out in the sheet on the study guide, so you can look at it there. Amar Rabbi Elazar, nafkale mehaik. He learns it from this pasuk. The subject here is shomrim. You give somebody something to watch. What kind of things you give them to watch? Chamor, osho, oseh. Different types of animals, a donkey, an ox, or a sheep. Prat, those are details. V'chol behema, then it says, and all animals. Kalal, you all of a sudden became more general. That includes all animals, like lions, tigers, bears. Okay, right, quoting from Wizard of Oz. Lishmor, chazal, uparat. So now, the word to watch obviously does not include lions and tigers and bears. You can't really watch them, right? They're not animals that you can really protect from harming others. So chazal, parat. Pratu, klalu, prat. So here you have the structure, details, generalization, details. Hadran ela ke'ena prat. From there we learn, when we're talking about laws of shomrim and you're responsible only if it's an animal that can be watched. If it can't be an animal that can be watched, it's not included here in the laws. So lions, tigers, bears, they're on the outs. Rava Amar, nafkale mehaikra, a little bit of a less interesting pursuit. Now we're talking about sacrifices. We're in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, first chapter, verse 10. Start saying there, if you're going to bring an animal to the temple as a burnt offering, and it says, im minatzon, I'll read you the whole pasuk first. If it's from the tzon, from the sheep, goats, that category, korbano, minak savim, or minaizim, from the sheep or from the goats. Le'olah zachar tamim yakriven. So now, where's the prat, klal, prat? Well, the word min itself is if from. From always means, you might remember this, we've learned it many times, whenever you have the word from, it means we're not talking about all of them. From the tzon means not all the tzon, but from it, some of it. So im min is prat. That's already min, from specific. Then tatzon, son is a general term to include all types of things that fall into that category. Then into those types of animals, sheep, goats, etc. Then it says savim v'izim, which are sheep and goats. Chazal uparat, that's detail again. Prat uklal uprat, Hadran ela ke'en haprat. Now, it doesn't say exactly what the prat is in all these cases, by the way, I want to point out. And there are some debates about what actually is derived from each of these. Okay, I'm going with one explanation, but know that there's different explanations in all these cases. What this comes to teach you is, there's a bit of people raise questions on this. It's not sheep and goats that were used for a sin. For example, if they were used if they engage in bestiality, then you can't use them, okay? Animal having relations with a human, that forbids the animal from being brought as a sacrifice. Some people say, well, that's not really excluded from sheep and goats because they're still called the sheep and the goat, even if they were used. But the point is, it has to limit something. That must be what it's limiting, because they can't imagine what else it would limit, because really all tzon could be brought as a sacrifice. So they come up with, if the animal was used for an avera, something like bestiality, they start making all sorts of distinctions between what type of avera would disqualify, what wouldn't. Basically, bestiality seems to be the main one. That would then basically take it out. You can't use those for sacrifices. So that's another prat klal prat. So we have Rabbi Abba with the laws of shomrim, we have Rava with the laws of sacrifices. Amar Rav Yehuda mi Diskarta, the Rav. Rav Yehuda from Diskarta says to Rava, that's name of a place, not the regular Rav Yehuda that we know. He says to Rava, "V'leilav min hadin kraf." Why'd you skip? There's Vayikra, you skipped to verse 10, but verse 2 already has this. Where? Min, okay, so let's read the pasuk again. A person who sacrifices a korban, min habeima, from the animal, min habakal min hatzon. So first it says animal, which is a more general term. Then it says either cattle or the sheep family. So now that's already specific. So again, we have min, prat, habeima, klal, bakar, v'tzon, chazar, parat. So therefore we have, again, means some say not all behemot, not all animals. Then it says which kind of animals? Only sheep and the cattle family. So that would exclude what? Undomesticated animals, which we know, by the way, can't be brought as sacrifices. So why don't you say, here's a good example of prat, klal, prat. Why do you use the next example? Here's a perfectly good example that you skipped over. Amar le. Min hai mina. You can't really learn it from there. Why? Because if you wanted to learn from there, I would have said to you, ha-behema, turning out on the bet, behema. The word behema in the Torah is not only used to teach domesticated animals. Often, even though, like when you talk about categories, we just talked about this with the koi, there's behema and there's chaya. But in the Torah, for example, in laws of kashrut, it says, these are the behemot you can't eat, and then it lists. Okay, and then it lists, or a behemot you can eat. And then it lists kosher, right? It lists also chayot. Okay, so you end up with the word behema in the Torah includes chayah. So you can't say that this excludes chayot. Amarle, he says, what are you talking about? Chayah bichlal behema. How can you possibly say that in this pasuk a chayah is included in behema? Rabbi Yehuda says to him. And then Rava tries to say, because Rabbi Yehuda said, why do you use this drasha? And he says, because that drasha isn't clear. Because behema could include chayah, to which he said, there's no way behema in that pasuk includes chayah, because why? Haktiv bakarutzon v'havele pratu klal yetadan elakena prat. That was just what I was trying to say. Maybe you would have thought, he's basically saying, I don't understand your question. That was my whole point. Behema could theoretically include chayah, but as soon as you get specific and say we're talking about cattle or sheep, it's obviously included only domesticated animals and not non-domesticated animals. This is really a question why Rabbi even asked that question. Maybe he was just trying to come up with some retort to his question. It's not really, Rabbi's question is not really so great. So in the end, what we have here, after we dealt with the first section about Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria and what he did with Kartzanim Ba'adzag, how he learned to klal prat klal, and did he in fact at all, right? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, and then we came up with a way to explain it. Then we basically wanted to know, Rabbi Eliezer, who holds Ulavin and Alim are included, and we don't darshan klal prat here, where does he learn pratu klal prat? And we gave three possibilities. Shomrim, when you're watching someone's item, or two different verses by the korbanot. And Rava and Rabbi Yehuda have this back and forth about the behemot and the chayot, whether you could really learn it from there or not. Now the Gemara asks the question, and here's where we start getting into things that are not so clear. There's problem number one here and problem number two at the very end of our sugya, where there's multiple interpretations. What exactly this question is, nobody really knows, or people suggest, but it's not clear. The question reads literally, Minal and Dahachihu. How do we know that this is the case? What is the case? We don't really know. So I'm going to leave the question as an open question. I don't know really what this question is. Okay, perhaps it's asking about klal. The answer is going to be, we're going to tell you a klalu pratu klal, which we haven't gotten to yet. So where that question, what the question is, we don't really know. But they're now going to bring an example of a klalu pratu klal. And from there, I don't want to spend too much time on the question that, the commentaries question what exactly is the question, but we're going to go to the content of the answer. And from here, we're going to basically show, until now we had a prat, klal, prat, where we start detail, specific detail. Now we're going to have a klal, prat, klal. And then we're going to have all sorts of questions, and really the questions that you've been wanting to know, which is, okay, what's the difference between a klal, prat, and klal, and a prat, klal, and prat? What's the difference between klal and prat and miut, ribui, which I kind of told you in the beginning of class, but we're going to see it inside. And we're actually going to see what the sugya says here absolutely contradicts what I said at the beginning of class, which is going to raise a whole other set of problems. Anyway, we're going to start with our answer. Ditanya. Now we're going to quote a section about Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni is the tithe that you bring in years 1, 2, 4, and 5, where you bring your fruits to the temple, a tenth of your fruits, and you eat them in the Beit HaMikdash. But normally you would redeem it on a coin. You bring the coin to Jerusalem, and you buy with it other things. Now, what can you buy with it? That's the big question, and that's what we're going to learn here. You can give the money for anything you want. That's obviously a general statement. But then it says, so that's klal. Babakal ubatzon bayayin ubeshecha. Now it says cattle and sheep, wine and beer, prat. That's pretty specific. Bechol asher tishachan nafshecha chazar v'kalal. But then it says, and anything you want. So now we have generalization, detailed generalization. That's the opposite of prat, klal, prat. So the question is, what do we learn from this? Lalu pratu klal, ia tadan ela kein haprat. It sounds like it's no different from pratu klal prat, because in the end, it's going to be only things that are similar to the details. How so? Ma prat meforash pri mi pri v'gidulei karka. We now have to define what's the common denominator between all the things listed, the details. Well, all of them are pri mi pri. They're born or created from another one of the same kind. An animal is born from an animal. A fruit grows from the seed that came from that fruit. So that's something similar about them. And gidulei karka, and they grow from the ground. Now, animals don't grow from the ground, but they do get their nourishment from the ground. Af kol pri mi pri v'gidulei karka. So it has to be anything that's similar in those ways. You can use it to buy what you want to buy. Michti, what you have your master sheni money for. Michti klal uprat uklal ke'ein prata daininan. So now they say, wait a minute. Question number one, we're going to have a slew of questions about how these drashot work. If you just had klal uprat, what's the rule? Generalization and a specific. The rule is iatadan ela ke'ein prat. So a generalization, if you start off general and you get specific, the rule is it's only things that are similar to the detail. So if you now have, think about it, it's very logical. Generalization, detail, and generalization, also iatadan ela ke'ein prat. It's also only like the detail. That's what we just learned. Then why do you need the last klal? You could have learned the exact same halacha without that last piece. So that's the words here. Again, I'll read it inside. Michti klal uprat. Since if you just had a klal and prat without the klal at the end, my mistake. Michti klal uprat klal. When you have klal prat klal, ke'ein prata dainina, right? And there you say it's only like the prat. Klal batra ma'ahane. What do we need this last klal for? Because even just a regular klal prat would give you the same thing. So it seems totally unnecessary to have three things here. Ahane lo sufe kol dedami. What they say is this comes to include more things. Okay, it's all just relative. It's going to be anything that's somewhat similar to it is going to be included. So we're going to include more things in a klal prat to klal than we would in a klal prat. This is all very logical. You just have a klal and then you get specific, you start off general, you get specific. So we're going to be very limited. If you add another generalization term, general term at the end, you're going to start including anything that's kind of similar to it. So it's more inclusive. Now they're going to say, since we dealt with that with klal prat to klal, we're going to ask the same question with a prat to klal prat, the one we started with today. V'tu prat to klal prat ke'ein a prat daininan. If you have a specific, a generalization, and a specific, we go like the specific. So prata batrai ma'ahane, what do we need this last prat for? You could have learned the same thing from prat to klal, but that's not true. But they're suggesting maybe it would be true. To which they answer, which we already saw, which is ila prata batra. That's where we started today. The whole purpose of chartanim va'adzag were to teach you that if you didn't have that, what will we say? You start with specific and you get more general. What did we learn? Remember, it includes much more, right? So if you didn't have that last one, havamina, you would have said, and not just you would have, by mistake, you would have actually said, and you'd be right. The fact that you started specific and then became general and you ended right there, that would obviously include many more things. We're going to be much more inclusive and say the klal is actually added. That's why you need the prat, okay? The first one wasn't so convincing because both of them really is like the prat. Klal prat and klal prat to klal is going to be just like this specific one. But there we're going to say it's kind of a range of how specific you're going to be. Whereas here, right, we're going to include more things if it ends with the klal. But here we're going to say if you just have prat to klal, you actually would include way more things. And therefore the prat comes to teach you it's only ke'ein prata dainin. Okay, it's only like the specifics. Now they say, okay, now here the language is a little weird, but it's very simple. Michti train klale uprata. If you have two klals and a prat, which basically means klal prat klal, which is where we just were with the maser sheni. Utrain prate uklala, and you have prat klal uprat. And both of them are basically saying the same thing. Remember, what's the rule for both of them? Only like the specific, the details. Okay, so we have klal, prat, klal, prat, and they both seem to say the same thing. So what's the difference, right? Here the Gemara is asking all the questions that we want to ask, which is, I don't get it. You have this kind, you have that kind. They're all basically saying the same thing. So why would the Torah in one case go this way and in the other time go this way? So since both that and that, ke'ein plata daininan, we say it's only like the details. Ma'ika bene bene. What's the difference between the two of them? To which the Gemara answers, ika. There is a difference. Here's a minor difference. Not so minor, but Te'ilu tartin klal prate. Again, they're saying two klals and a prat, which means klal, prat, klal, general, specific, general. If you have it similar in one way, it has to be similar just in one way, not more than one way. You need it similar with one attribute. But when you have prat, klal, prat, you can see where this is going. It has to be similar in two ways. If it's similar in two ways, it has two characteristics that are the same, then you can include it. But if it's only similar in one way, lo marbina, we can't include it. So that's why prat klalu prat is different from klalu prat klal, because if you start and end with generalizations, we're going to include things that are similar in one way only. If you do the specific, general, specific, if that's the order in the Torah, we're going to learn from there. Only things that are similar in two ways are going to be included. It has to be similar in both. It has to have two similar characteristics. One is not enough. Now we finally get to our final question. If you have a prat and klal, what do we say? The klal adds to the prat. And we're now going to go more general because you ended with general. And miut v'riba nami, riba hakol. And if you use the miut ribui track, you're going to have something also specific and something general, and you're going to end with general. We're going to include everything. So now the obvious question is, right? Riba hakol vir itrabe kol mile. So the same thing. You're going to include everything. So ma'ika be miut v'riba, the prat klal. So what's the difference between these two methods? I don't get it. Right? In our case, like I said, in our specific case, one was saying prat, klal, prat, and the other one was only saying two, right? The miut, ribui, and therefore they included more things. But here we're saying if you didn't have that, like let's say our case, and they're going to specifically use our example. Let's say the rabbis didn't use the chartzanim ba'adzag. Let's say it wasn't there. And they used klal prat methodology. You started with the detail and then you got to a generalization. So what would they say? So, ika. Now, before we even read this, let's just talk about what I told you in the beginning of class. I told you that if you use the miut ribui methodology, you're going to end up including more things. And the klal prat methodology is usually more limited. Okay? So we're basically going to say, just like when we said klal prat klal is more inclusive than prat klal prat in this one unique way, you would have expected we'd say the same thing here. The klal prat methodology is going to be more limiting. Ribui is going to somehow add something that wasn't added in the klal prat. But the Gemara actually says the opposite. So the Gemara says, if you just use prat klal methodology, you would include the leaves and the tendrils. Miut v'riba would say lulavin in alim lo. If you use the miut v'riba, you would get to the tendrils, yes, the leaves, not. Okay. This is quite difficult for many ways. Number one, it contradicts what I just said earlier. That's the first problem. But yes, there's a bigger problem, which is, who used miut v'riboy? Rabbi Eliezer. And what did Rabbi Eliezer say? The lulavin and the alim are a problem, right? And here it distinguishes between lulavim and alim. So this Gemara has troubled all the commentaries and nobody knows what to do with it. There's several different versions of the text, which is probably the way to go. This is not a correct version of the text. There's clearly a mistake here. Some people, Tosfot tries to explain it and says the lulavim here are not the lulavim we were talking about before. The word lulav here is talking about the inedible parts, whereas the alim includes the tendrils. I'm not going to even go to all the possible answers because there's clearly a problem here. And the fact that everything we know about ribui and miut and klal prat in other places, the miut and the ribui actually includes more things, and the klal prat is limiting more. So some people have different versions and learn this totally differently because it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, so I'll go back and review before we go to the very last line, which really is going to continue into tomorrow, but let's just do a quick review of our daf. And we'll point out where we had some issues, okay? Where we have inconclusive things that we kind of have to leave as open questions because we don't really know how to relate to them. So the first thing we did was we quoted this whole thing that we saw yesterday about the why we get to pre and psolet pre, right? And not just anything that's like the pre, but also the psolet of it. And then we said at the end there, the whole reason why it says Hartzanim ba'adzag is to teach you. Hartzanim ba'adzag is a prat, and prat, klal, prat, it wanted to teach you if you just have prat u klal, we're going to be more general. If you add a prat at the end, like in Nazir, like in our case, it's to be more specific. What does Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria do with that? Because he needs Hartzanim ba'adzag for something else. Okay, we already dealt with that. 2 possible answers. Then we went to Rabbi Eliezer and we said, well, you do ribui miut, but you must also do prat u klal u prat. Where do you get that from? We brought 3 possible answers, whereas 2 and 3 were kind of a little bit of a back and forth. Why didn't you learn from here? And he said why he didn't, and he explained why he could, etc. But basically, you end up with 3 different answers. Then we wanted to know we don't know what that question was. Minal and dahachihu. We don't really know, like, from where do you get this from? And they end up quoting a klal upratu klal case, so we're not really sure what that was answering. But we end up going into all sorts of questions about klal uprat and prat and klal and ribui and miut and all that, where we basically bring a klal uprat klal case. We explain what the law is. Then we say, what's the difference between klal uprat and klal uprat klal? Because they both seem to be doing the same thing. Then we said, why do you need in prat klal prat, the last prat, which we already knew you needed, because without that prat, you're actually going to really be more general. Then we said, what's the difference between klal prat klal and prat klal prat? Because they both seem to be saying the same thing. They're not exactly, right? We talked about similar in one way, similar in 2 ways. Then we said, what's the difference between ribui and miut and klal prat, which we were expecting a great answer, and we end up getting a very confusing answer, which just complicates everything and goes against what is seen in other sugyot. Doesn't make a lot of sense. As I said, all the commentaries grapple with this, and everyone kind of goes in a different direction, trying to figure out how this can make sense, and some having very different versions of the text, because this version of the text seems to be a mistake, most likely. Okay, last line for today, which starts a whole new topic, which is connected with our Mishnah. If you remember, Rabbi Akiva had said, if you soak it in wine, then you're going to be liable for eating a kazayit of the bread, even if there's not a kazayit of wine in there. And he seemed to be arguing about 2 things. Number one, you need a kazayit of wine, not a ribui, and that you can do it even if there's not a kazayit of wine. So, and we said that the whole principle he was using is called heter mitzdaref leisur. That when you have heter and isur together, something permitted, something forbidden, they join together for the shiur, for the requisite amount. So now we're going to say the following. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yavau, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yavau says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol isurin shebetorah, when it comes to anything forbidden in Torah law, ein heter mitzdaref leisur. We don't use this principle at all, except for chutz mi isurei Nazir, other than for Nazir. Sheharei amra Torah mishrat. Because the Torah says mishrat, because that was in that pasuk with all the details. We didn't talk about too much, but it said kol mishrat anavim, anything soaked in grapes. So that means anything soaked in grapes is forbidden. In this case, we're going to say it's forbidden. The object that's soaked in grapes, it doesn't matter how many grapes are in there, how much wine is in there. The object itself is what's forbidden, and therefore we're going to go by kazayit of the object. But that's a unique halacha by Nazir. This is a topic we're going to continue into tomorrow's daf. So we'll stop here for today. Wishing everybody a great day, and I'll remind you about Rabbanit Michelle Farber's class starting on Sunday. My class is now finished about the accidental murder, the skills class, which is breakout room chavruta type class. Very different from Rabbanit Michelle Farber, which is more a lecture class of all sorts of background information. She's going to be talking about terms used, methodologies used for Mishnah. She's going to get to halacha also. In the middle, we'll deal with stam, like all these statements in the Gemara that appear without names, and what are the typical questions you might expect to find there, typical structures. It's very helpful to put things into a context. And in the third shiur, we'll get to halacha. How do we get halacha from the Gemara? Which is a fascinating topic. So recommended you all register and join the class. You can also watch it in your own time if you can't make it at the times that it is. Pay attention to the times because of the time change in certain countries. It's going to change times in Israel and England, for example. Different weeks it will be different times. There was nothing to do about that. Okay, so that's about Rabbanit Leah's class starting on Sunday, and you have to register for it, but all the course is free, as are all our services. Okay, wishing everyone a great day.